Meet Johan Rockström, the internationally recognized scientist on global sustainability issues who led the development of the Planetary Boundaries Framework. He's currently a professor in Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam and director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research.
Welcome to the broadcast, Johan Rockström. We are very excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone on this so decisive Earth Day in the midst of one of the most turbulent occasions since World War II at least. And what I will do with you is to share the scientific evidence of why we have a systemic challenge that can be encapsulated in a social, health, and environmental crisis that requires a new relationship between humanity and the planet and transformations towards a safe and just operating space on Earth for humanity in the future. Now, as you all may know, and let's see if I can there we are. Scientifically, we can today conclude that we've entered the Anthropocene. And not only are we in this new geological epoch, the Anthropocene that we entered in the 1950s, we're deep in the Anthropocene. The scale, speed, and interconnections in the globalized world is starting to send invoices back to humanity. And we have been warning for this, both in terms of the risk for pandemics, but also in terms of droughts, floods, heat waves, and irreversible changes when crossing tipping points for many years. The corona crisis is not a black swan. It was predicted, and it was not a question if, it was a question when we would have this kind of abrupt feedback in a world that is so interconnected and taking so large risks in terms of losing fundamental redundancy and diversity and preparedness and stable relationships between humans and natural systems. This has, as we know, been well manifested, for example, in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Reports, which is the largest overview of scanning global catastrophic risks on the x-axis in terms of likelihood of risk and on the y-axis in terms of impact on the economy and businesses. And I'm sure you're well aware, in the upper right-hand corner in the 2020 version of this report, you have all these green RUMs, which is the high likelihood and high impact risk of climate inaction, loss of biodiversity, extreme weather, all the parameters that has to do with fundamentally threatening the life support systems on Earth. Now you can ask yourself, so where is the risk of pandemics? Well, it is there in the left-hand circle, the risk of infectious disease outbreaks as epidemics and pandemics. So impact very high, but the likelihood was not perceived as being as high as the risks of global environmental change. I would argue this has scientific support, that the scientific risk landscape in terms of irreversible changes that undermines the long-term existential ability for humanity are actually higher than the risks of pandemic outbreaks, but the impact factors are the same. Now, in terms of what we're seeing across the world, now this slide should have come in different steps here, unfortunately, but we have increasing evidence also to see how different drivers are interacting. To the furthest left is the current disastrous scenario or trajectory in Southern Africa with several years of drought, food insecurity, and locust outbreaks now interacting with the corona pandemic, potentially putting us in a perfect storm of really devastating impacts of food insecurity interacting with health insecurity. The current devastating and knowledge base in terms of how global warming amplifies the risk of forest fires, like, for example, the Australian fire season, which in terms have feedbacks on reinforcing global warming, which in turn has impacts on food security and thereby also the resilience of societies to deal with shocks such as the current pandemic. When we look at the sources of these pandemics, they're all related to zoonotic disease outbreaks, which is transmissions or spillovers of virus from domestic animals or from wildlife. We have currently, in the depth of the Anthropocene, come to a point, believe it or not, where 96% in weight of mammals on Earth is from domesticated animals and humans, and only 4% are wildlife, and that we've lost over 80% of marine and wild mammals on land and marine mammals in the ocean. So we are truly in a point where we are changing the entire composition of living species on Earth, and we have scientific evidence that shows that 75% of the zoonotic virus outbreaks to date originate from primates, bats, and rodents. So these are wildlife species that are generalists, that can penetrate into human residents and settlements, and that are able to handle pressures on natural ecosystems when species disappear on the kind of IUCN red list. These are species that are more generalist and are able to survive in broader changed environments that are influenced by us humans. Colliding with wet markets and wildlife markets, this becomes the perfect brew for pandemic outbreaks. So what you see here is scientific evidence showing that the health crisis is connected with the sustainability crisis. Now, the sustainability crisis is deep and getting deeper. What you see here is a report that was published just a few months before the pandemic outbreak called United in Science, presented at the United Nations. And this graph is the most prominent one in this report, showing the advancements in science in terms of risk analysis over the past 20 years. So these are 3 clusters, and each cluster include, on the furthest left, the risk of destabilizing ecosystems or big biomes like the rainforests. In the middle cluster here, you have the risk of triggering extreme weather events like droughts and floods. And to the furthest right, the most concerning one is the risk to trigger large-scale, catastrophic, irreversible events, like, for example, destabilizing the Greenland ice sheet. Now, the darker the color, the higher the risk in terms of scientific assessment. What you see on the y-axis here is global mean temperature from the pre-industrial level of 0 up to 6 degrees warming, which is then the disastrous, very unlikely future well beyond RCP 8.5, the worst case scenario. Now, what you see here is each column is one IPCC assessment, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the furthest left is the knowledge base in science in 2001, the 3rd assessment. Then you have the 4th assessment in 2009, the 5th assessment in 2014, and then the last column is the 1.5 report in 2018. Now look at the pattern. As you see science advancing, the color and the darker the hue gets lower and lower in temperature. What this means is that 19 years ago, we thought that the real big risks were not likely to occur when we went below 5-6 degrees Celsius warming. Basically, it was impossible. Today, the risk landscape is down at 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warming for catastrophic risks. So the more we learn, the more we must recognize that the planet is very vulnerable to our pressures, and that these pressures are not only environmental pressures, they're about irreversible potential undermining life support systems for food, energy, and also having implications for health. That is why we, a few months ago, in a published paper in Nature and a high-level dialogue with heads of state in the United Nations, declared a state of planetary emergency together with the Club of Rome. Emergency in terms of coming too close to potential catastrophic tipping points, and that these are irreversible, and that the way to avoid them is what happens over the next decade in terms of shifting the direction of travel. This means, in conclusion, that the climate crisis is interconnected and intertwined with the health crisis and the ecosystem crisis. And that this is our challenge today, to learn from the corona crisis, to recover after that towards a more resilient and sustainable trajectory, so we can have a full win-win pathway where we reduce risks of irreversible changes in terms of life support systems, while at the same time avoiding risks of repercussions on health. Now, how can we do this? Well, this has been discussed before in the sessions here. I know that the pathways on climate is really about following what we call the carbon law. The carbon law is inspired by the Moore's law of a trajectory of cutting emissions by half every decade. Then we follow the scientific path that can take us to well below 2 degrees Celsius to avoid triggering irreversible changes in the Earth system. Now, that trajectory looks as follows when we just kind of portray the global trajectories we need to follow. So on the x-axis here, you have time from today, 2020, up until the end of this century. In gray, on the y-axis, you have emission of greenhouse gases and fluxes of carbon dioxide. But this is just billion tons of carbon dioxide. Now, you see that the curve in gray bends this year. This is one key message. 2020, despite the catastrophic pandemic, remains the super year for humanity. It is the year when we need to bend the global curve of emissions and decisively follow the carbon law of cutting emissions by half every decade to take us to a net zero world economy by 2050 in only 30 years' time. But that's not enough. That will not take us to a safe future. We also need to transition the whole food system in the world from being the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the dark brown slice there, to become the world's largest single sink of carbon in the world by the next half of this century in orange. Then whether we like it or not, we need to have major negative emission through CCS and BECCS in yellow. And as if that was not enough, we also need to maintain the carbon sinks in the natural ecosystems, keeping natural habitats that host wildlife that can keep us away from pandemics intact. And this is the green in terrestrial ecosystems and blue in the oceans. And if we do all of this, we have a 66% chance of reaching 1.5. So as you see, we're talking of a grand global sustainability transition, not only for the sake of a stable planet, but for the sake of avoiding abrupt catastrophic feedbacks such as the current pandemic. Now, the climate action roadmap that was presented a few years back has been translated into an exponential roadmap, which has been presented earlier here, I know, which is an attempt to translate the science towards an assessment of what can we accomplish. Can we actually follow the carbon law by cutting emissions by half every decade if we look carefully at current technologies in different sectors? Now, this has been mapped in a very elaborate way in collaboration with Conservation International and the Nature-Based Solution and our Natural Climate Solution Initiative, with Project Drawdown, with Future Earth and other partners, showing from the evidence we have today, so this is not utopian fantasies, this is technologies we have today, that we can cut emissions by half in essentially all the sectors in society, be it energy, industry, buildings, transport, but also in nature sinks and in natural climate solutions that have a large potential in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions over this very urgent point we are at right now. You see that food there is actually increasing its emission, which is one of those recognitions that we really have to take seriously. We are today 7.7 billion people. We're soon 10 billion people on Earth. We have 1 billion people absolute malnourished, 3 billion people undernourished. We need to recognize that the food sector will be associated with increased emission of greenhouse gases, often non-CO2 gases, which will require even faster reduction in emissions in other sectors. So the food sector, while it can transition into becoming a natural carbon sink through management will still be associated, we assess, to certain degrees of emissions. Now, all of this has been translated into a 1.5 degrees Celsius playbook that is a operational framework for businesses and cities and organizations around the world of how to take on the carbon law as pathways for a safe future. So then, in summary, what does all this mean? Well, it does actually force us to think in terms of systems, to understand that health, sustainability, prosperity, and equity are all, so to say, intertwined together for the Sustainable Development Goals that have to be accomplished today within the safe operating space of the planetary boundaries on a stable planet. And we can never escape this. The pandemic is a reminder, a lesson, and it's now a question of how can we recover from this crisis in a way that can place us in a much more stronger position towards a safe and just future for humanity on Earth. And therefore, the Earth Day is, of course, the perfect moment for that dialogue. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Johan Rockström, for sharing your insights with us and the audience. Let's see what questions we have gotten from the viewers.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hello, Professor Rockström, Nick Nuttall here. So we got a question which is similar to one we had earlier in the week, but I think it's worth asking because it also kind of, I feel this as well a little bit. I mean, you've been working on this for some time. You package all this stuff in a way that's so clear and so interesting and so compelling. And yet you have leaders in places like Brazil and Russia, USA, Hungary, Poland, Australia. This is the question from the member of the audience. How do we, in a sense, change the minds of these people when what you have in front of you here right now is the evidence of what you can do to create a better world? Where is the break in the understanding in some countries?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And then you've been part of this yourself for so long time, struggling with providing and putting forward not only the evidence, but the narrative of why it's worth protecting the planet for our own future. And we have, in all honesty, not succeeded. In many parts, we even failed. And the question is, what is the solution to be able to shift the whole logic towards success? And I'm absolutely convinced today that the way to get Bolsonaro on board and Trump on board and Putin on board and, well, Modi for that matter, and Xi and, of course, our dear friends in Australia as well, is to make it absolutely clear that the pathway, the sustainability or the sustainable pathway is the pathway to success and prosperity. That I'll give you one anecdote on this just 2 days ago. So here in Germany, where I'm sitting right now, there is also here some political pressure to, put a pause button on climate action and the very expensive climate package and phasing out coal here in Germany because of the pandemic. What happened just hours after political leaders stepped out and started to debate this is that the car industry, with Daimler as the kind of frontier, stepped out and said, look here, we don't support this. We want to continue our pathway to decarbonize. We are now absolutely convinced that our competitiveness and our ability to really create jobs and stay as one of the big players in providing mobility is through electric mobility, is by investing in hydrogen and fuel cells and being a frontier player. And I think that was very telling to me that when the industry steps forward and kind of snaps the political leaders on the fingers and warning them not to let go of the pressure on the sustainability accelerator. And of course, we haven't reached that point in the countries that you referred to, but I think we're really at a point where, let's say, the race is on. And I feel very encouraged by the fact that already now, in the midst of this pandemic crisis, that we are able to talk so openly about the interactions between the health crisis and the sustainability crisis, and that they are connected, and that the recovery plan has to be sustainable. Already that shows a degree of maturity.